Hello everyone, welcome to another Shmup topic video. It's been a hot minute, but we are returning in style, and today we're discussing the importance of graphics and visuals, specifically the importance of graphics and visuals in shmups, shoot 'em ups, STG, shooters, whatever you want to call them, because I feel like in this genre, above all other genres, and maybe I am biased because I like shmups the best, but in this genre, having those visuals locked in and having them be compelling is absolutely fundamental, and it is the difference between a great shmup and a top tier shmup, a good shmup and a bad shmup. Getting those visuals right and getting those visuals to connect with the player is absolutely pivotal. And of course, this sounds like an extremely obvious point. People will discuss these types of things in reviews and all that sort of stuff. So why does this need a video? Well, I think that there are certain aspects of this topic I want to dig in on that may not be as commonly discussed. I want to clear up some misconceptions, especially when I start doing more shmup reviews going forward. And I also want to just sort of defend a viewpoint that I think some people may view as shallow or that type of thing, where I'm a big person when it comes to aesthetics. I find aesthetics in themselves extremely important. I remember I had this discussion with a friend. My friend is like a intellectual philosopher and all that sort of stuff. And we were discussing the importance of book covers, the literal, saying, don't judge a book by its cover type of thing. I'm the type of person, and maybe you can tell by my attempts at appealing thumb art and things like that, but I'm a person who believes deeply in the importance of covers, and being someone who lives around artists and has a lot of time with artists and things like that, yes, I am very prone to believing in the value of aesthetics much more than I think maybe people who are a little bit more like intellectual and that type of thing. But anyway, the point I want to begin with is just by introducing what you are seeing on screen here. So the game I am playing right here is a Touhou fan game by Star X, and it's called Touhou Danmaku Shooting Festival 2 or something like that. It's got a massive title. I'll just link it in the video description. But what I find so compelling about this specific Touhou fan game is that the visuals and the graphical presentation are head and shoulders better than the actual, Zun official Touhou games. And I think that is a great direction for the series to go. This is my biggest criticism of Touhou, and something that I remember in my podcast with the CEO of EXA, we were both kind of discussing this, and maybe in a little bit different perspectives. In his perspective, he wasn't sure if Touhou would be that compelling of an EXA title because of the sort of the moe style he felt like may not be as appealing to Westerners. And I was like, well, I think Westerners are not that disinterested in moe, considering all the moe anime and all those types of things that seem to be popular. I thought the bigger issue with Touhou is the literal visual quality of the games, right? Especially the newer releases, where it's been a long time. Zun's had a lot of time to sort of ramp up the production value, but I know he hasn't, and I know that isn't the point of Touhou. I remember having not arguments, but disagreements about this, where, if I was in Zun's shoe and I saw how popular and how powerful Touhou has become, I would bring in some artists and say, okay, make these visuals better. I don't have to literally do everything by myself anymore, but that's maybe my American perspective on this, right? Keep trying to build up and all that type of thing. But anyway, I love what this guy doing, Star X and his team is doing, because they're doing exactly what I would love to see Touhou do and other shmups do, which is pushing those visuals ahead. And what I think is really cool about this game is it's very faithful to the Touhou style, but it's just that nice, clean, compelling upgrade. The backgrounds just look better, the colors look brighter, the character drawings look much more appealing, just really honing in on what makes Touhou appealing aesthetically, but then improving it. And I think this is a big hurdle a lot of shmups may run into moving forward, especially when we look at 3D shmups and games that have like a 2D pixel-based past and they've been upgraded into 3D. Sometimes that works out, and sometimes, in my opinion, it looks bland and awful. One that comes to mind is, I think wasn't there a recent R-Type? If it's not R-Type, it's one of those, right? Where it was like a recent re-release, but in my opinion, it just looked bland and cheap, and I thought the pixel graphics were actually much more compelling. But I think if you do it right, 3D shmups could look really cool. You just gotta make sure you're having a really nice, visceral, interesting, eye-catching graphical presentation. But I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself. So the thing that I want to hone in on first with this topic is what I think separates shmups from a lot of other stuff. Let's talk about RPGs, right? Everyone loves to compare RPGs and shmups. When you look at Final Fantasy VII Remake, I thought the visuals in that game were extremely good. Kudos to them for nailing that. And I think what's interesting is when you look at the sort of landscape for AAA games and stuff like that, especially Japanese AAA games, they tend to have extremely good graphics. That's not an issue. Usually the issue with these games, like the Final Fantasy games and stuff like that, not that I'm an expert in those, but open world games, all that sort of stuff. Usually a lot of the issues people have are with the stories or the gameplay itself or how they design the open world, all that sort of stuff. Very rarely is graphics a huge issue because these companies put so much time and energy into graphics, where I feel like we're kind of on the other side of that with shmups, where, in all honesty, I think a lot of shmups that come out, even ones that aren't even that well known, like some indie shmups and all that sort of stuff, and I'm going to try and feature more of those shmups on this channel, they have really solid gameplay. Overall, you can say, yeah, this developer knew what they were doing. Rolling Gunner is a great example of that. Rolling Gunner has extremely solid gameplay. And I think the visuals, Rolling Gunner is quirky enough with its visuals that I wouldn't say they're bad or anything like that, but they could be better, right? I don't think anyone could deny that. If they could up those Rolling Gunner visuals to a little bit more of the Crimson Clover sort of tier, I think that game would have a larger appeal, especially outside the genre. But what I'm getting at is, with shmups, compared to these larger budget games, the layers between the player and the essential gameplay are very thin. There is not a lot separating the player from the game. That's why I love them so much. They are much more of a fundamental genre. I hate the term simple. It drives me crazy when people say shmups are simple, because it's like, shmups simple, I'm getting a little bit sidetracked here, but yeah, they're a fundamental genre because there aren't a lot of ingredients there, but the ingredients need to be rock solid and cooked to perfection. It's like the difference between a 5-star chef and a chef at Olive Garden or something like that, where I'm not an expert on cooking, but from what I understand, most 5-star chefs and really highly rated chefs don't use that many ingredients. What they do is they use simpler dishes, right? But they really hone in and precisely cook everything to perfection, to where the flavors that you want stand out very strongly. Whereas if you go to like an Olive Garden, I have a beef with Olive Garden because I don't like their food, but if you go to an Olive Garden and you order their pasta and stuff like that, there's a lot of flavor in there, but it's a lot of just jumbled, just throw everything in there, assault the mouth sort of flavor. Whereas when you get really good Italian food, it's simpler, but it's much stronger and more focused, right? And that's how I think shmups are, where if the visuals go wrong, they go real wrong, in my opinion. And basically, if a shmup has bland or uninteresting visuals, I'm not even sure if I would play it. And that sounds shallow, but I think the visuals are very directly tied into the reward system of shmups, more immediate than other genres. For example, when you are killing enemies and gaining score and scoring points, do you ever wonder why games like Crimson Clover and even Dononpachi in the cave games have so many medals and visual things going on with your score? It's because that is actually part of the reward system in your brain. Blowing up the boss or blowing up enemies with your hyper going and seeing all these stars fly out and all these explosions, and watch caves enemy death explosions. Sometimes with the bosses, they'll have like 4 different explosion animations and stuff like that, or they'll take damage in different parts of the ships and all that. All of that isn't just dressing. It isn't just the cover of the book. That is part of the book. That is the pages of the book. It is your reward for playing well. And that's what I think I'm trying to convey the most in this video, is that strong visuals give your game more value than bland visuals. And this is coming from someone who, if I ever made a shmup, I'm not sure how well done my visuals could look, but you could bet I'm going to try my best to at least make something happen visually that is rewarding and interesting and stuff like that, even if it looks a little bit crazy. Because I remember a good example of this is Space Moth DX, where when you look at the gameplay and all that sort of stuff, I think Space Moth DX has solid gameplay. I mean, it's not a poorly made game or anything like that, but the big problem with that game, and I talked about it in my example review of it, is just there is not enough visual reward for what you are doing. The death animations are very simple. The points are just kind of like going up. Even when you look at games where you're doing like overflow glitches and all that sort of stuff, the points themselves are, seeing the numbers go higher is a little bit of a reward. But if you think about it, the much higher reward is seeing all the visual effects around the points that bring up that score that make you go, hell yeah. Even in games like Danmaku and stuff like that with the maximum bonus, and you're seeing those numbers just scroll by really fast and stuff, like it's like you're winning a lottery or, rolling a slot machine or something like that. And I think this is my theory as to why there's so much score inflation in cave games. When you look at Danmaku, then you look at like SDOJ and how the gap, the scoring gets higher and higher and higher. I think the reason for that is because Cave is trying to increase the visual stimulus of the points you're getting. They're like, okay, more numbers, that's more stimulus. I think there's a point of sort of diminishing returns with that. I think Danmaku's scale of scoring is fine, or DOJ's, but anyway, before I get off the beaten track too much, I also want to address an important distinction, which is, of course, the kind of traditional digital foundry idea of graphical quality versus what I am trying to represent as graphical quality. There are a lot of games that I would consider having interesting graphics that aren't necessarily high resolution and all that sort of stuff, or detailed pixel art or those types of things. But it's more about, can you find an appealing aesthetic, basically? Can you find an aesthetic that connects with the player? Because I think it's better, in my opinion, this is kind of where we get into sort of the eye of the beholder type arguments. Sometimes bad art, quote unquote bad art, I'm doing air quotes here, can be more interesting to the eye than just like bland, cookie cutter. You go to a hotel room and there's a picture of a flower on the wall. Sometimes someone's shitty drawing where the stem's all up, not correctly drawn, and it's kind of weird and stuff like that. Sometimes that type of art can be more visually appealing, or at least interesting, than just this sort of bland, oh, there's a flower on my wall, but there's nothing interesting about it. And I think that is something shmups really struggle with, especially these days. Even with the sort of higher-ish budget releases, like I think there was an R-Type re-release where they did these 3D graphics for it. And in my opinion, those 3D graphics look awful. And they look awful because they're so generic and bland. And I hate generic and bland graphics. That's the worst to me. I'd rather see shitty graphics than visual bland graphic. This is why I'm not a fan of a lot of older Pixar-ish type stuff where it just looks like clay. Or Street Fighter V is another one like that, where it's not ugly, but it's just so bland and uninteresting that can you really get invested in it? Some Nintendo games are like that as well, I think, where I kind of don't like the direction Nintendo's taking with their graphics, because a lot of them are just really Pixar-ish and bland and cartoonish, but in a very generic way. And I think this is going to be where it's going to be hard to decide what you're doing with your shmup and stuff like that. But I think when let's say you're making an indie shmup right now, and you're trying to figure out what you want it to look like graphically, just some guidance I want to give is if you're going to go for the higher resolution, more commercial looking graphics, which I commend you for giving that a shot, it takes a lot more detailing and a lot more care to nail that. Where I think 2D art, if you're going to go for a little bit less detailing and stuff like that, you might want to just stick with 2D because it just looks better, less detailed by the nature of its format. Another example that this might be a little bit controversial, but I actually think a lot of PS1 games and N64 games even, minus some of their textures and stuff, look better than a lot of the more generic low budget games you see these days. Like for instance, I saw on Dreamcast Guy's channel, he reviewed a new Samurai Jack video game. That is like a prime example of what I'm talking about, where the visuals aren't ugly, but they are so generic and bland and they look like they were just pre-made that I would never play a game that looks like that. King of Fighters, the King of Fighters 15 I think it was, that came out, same thing. It wasn't ugly, but it was so barren that there's no reason to get into it. Whereas you look at like King of Fighters 95, there's no arguing that that thing is less graphically impressive, but at the same time it's got that at least a little bit of a lo-fi quality to it. And so just try and keep in mind, another good example of really engaging lo-fi art for me is a game called Ring 27, where it kind of looks like a game that's like a Game Boy game, but a little bit more powerful, maybe like a Game Boy Advance game or something like that. Or even Fire Lancer. I like the style they're going for, where it's like a Game Boy game, right? And that's what's that? The Wonder Swan game. Like, so as long as you have an aesthetic that is interesting, I think that's what really matters with shmups. But if we could start seeing people pushing their shmups forward into a little bit more detailed territory, I think that's going to be, as far as widestream appeal, that's going to be your number one entrance into widestream appeal. And I think Cuphead is the perfect example of that. No one would really care about Cuphead if Cuphead was just a bland looking... I don't think Cuphead is even that good gameplay wise. It's okay, but it doesn't seem like that great of a running gun to me gameplay wise. The visuals are what hold that game up so hard, right? And I think if we could find more shmups that can do that have that sort of wider appeal with their visuals, we're gonna see much more success for the genre moving forward, because we have an abundance of solid gameplay. There's a lot of shmups out there that have really fun gameplay, but the difference is that if the visuals are kind of bland or kind of uninteresting, you don't feel compelled to return, and it doesn't feel as meaningful, at least to me, than a game with really strong visuals, like Battle Garega, for instance. Look at Battle Garega. There's so much care given to that game's visuals. It is extremely rewarding, and it makes the game feel more complete. It makes the game feel more like a piece of art than something like a more generic sort of shmup that you'll see. I don't want to call out people you see, but a more generic looking shmup or something like that, right? And so that's the point I want to make in this video, is that I know it seems shallow to say, oh, aesthetics are very important. They are very fundamental to how the game is ingested by the player, I guess. So yeah, that is my point in this video, and keep an eye out for this Touhou fan series, because there's 1 and 2, and I'm really excited to see future installments, because I would love Touhou to continue moving in this direction, and I could see it bringing in a lot more players than just the older games, even though the older games from a gameplay perspective are very well done, right? And are pretty visually interesting. Touhou has that going for it, where it has that moe style that other things have. But I'm just saying, because it's so successful, I think they could have bumped up those visuals at some point, right? So anyway, let me end this video by thanking my patrons. So thank you to Dingo, Andy Capt, Anthony A, Ben Win, Corio, Eric H, Full Set, Retro Schmupper, Gus, Hausu, Kiwi, Joe Angelo, John, Game Boy Guru, K, Malaise, Mark Toms, Martin Worrell, Maz, Meher Kalendrian, Nathaniel Davis, and Electron, Okla Kugels, Smacky Factors, Sugumo, Plasmo, and Yuzakaya. Thanks for watching.